Welcome back. Let's practice solving investment problems. All right, so here's our first example. We want to find the amount of interest earned on an investment of $250 with an annual simple interest rate of 6% for 5 years. All right, so in these investment problems, we are always going to be working with some amount of money or investment that is generating simple interest over an amount of time in years. And to solve these problems, we need to use the following formula for calculating simple interest. The amount of simple interest earned, I, is equal to the amount of the investment, or the principal, P, times the simple interest rate, R, times the amount of time in years. Okay, and so because that is an amount of years, that simple interest rate will be an annual simple interest rate. And so in this problem, we are given some of these values, but one of them we don't know and we need to solve for. In this case, that would be the amount of interest earned, right? We want to find the amount of interest earned if we know all this other information. Okay, so let's identify what we know here. We know that the investment is $250, so that is the value of P. P is equal to 250. That is the investment, or the principal, in this scenario. Then we also know that the annual simple interest rate is 6%, so we can write that down as well. R is equal to 6%, but in the actual equation, we will want to work with that as a decimal. So as a decimal, R is equal to 0.06, right? That is 6% as a decimal. To get that, you can either divide 6 by 100 or just move the decimal place for the percentage 2 places to the left. All right, but then finally, we have the amount of time, which is 5 years. And that's good. We want to make sure that the amount of time T is in terms of years, and it is. So we don't have to make any adjustments to that value. Okay, sometimes you might be given an amount of months or some other type of period, and so in those cases you would want to convert it to be an amount of years. And you'll see that in an example later on in this video. Okay, but for now, these are the values that we have to work with. We want to use them in this equation to solve for the amount of interest earned, which would be I. So really there's not too much algebra going on here just yet, because the value of I is already solved for in this equation. If we were solving for one of these other values, then we would have to use some of our equation solving skills, but in this case, I is already solved for, so really we just have to do a little bit of math. Okay, so I, in this problem, will be equal to the investment, or the principal P, which is 250, so we have 250 multiplied by the simple interest rate R, which is 0.06 as a decimal, so we have 0.06, and that is multiplied by the amount of time in years, which is 5. All right, and then from there, to calculate the interest, just take 250 times 0.06 times 5, and that will give you the answer. Okay, so put that into a calculator, and you will find that I is equal to 75, and that is an amount of money, right? Interest is an amount of money, so you want to put some units with that. That is $75, which is the final answer to this problem. All right, so what this answer tells us is that an investment of $250 that earns an annual simple interest rate of 6% will generate $75 over a period of 5 years. All right, let's take a look at another example. Next up, we want to know how long would it take an investment of $680 to earn $612 in interest at an annual simple interest rate of 9%. Okay, so once again, we are going to use the same equation, that the amount of interest earned is equal to the amount of the investment times the simple interest rate times the amount of time in years. And so let's identify the values that we know in this equation. First thing that we are told is that we have an investment of $680. And so that would be the value of P, the amount of the investment, or the principal, is 680. And then we want to know how long it would take that investment to earn $612 in interest. So that is the amount of interest I. So I is equal to 612. And then finally, we are told that this investment has an annual simple interest rate of 9%. So that is very clearly the simple interest rate, which we represent with R. R would be equal to 9%, which as a decimal is 0.09. Once again, you can get that by dividing 9 by 100, or just moving the decimal place for the percentage 2 places to the left. All right, we want to use a decimal form of that rate in this equation. And so now it looks like what we don't know is the amount of time, right? We want to know how long would it take this investment to earn this amount of interest at this interest rate. So we're going to be solving for t in this equation. That will be the unknown value that we need to isolate and solve for. All right, so let's set it up. Let's put in the values that we know into this equation, and then we'll work on solving for t using our equation solving skills from algebra. So first up, the amount of interest I is 612, so 612 will be equal to the amount of the investment or the principal, 680. So we'll write in 680 multiplied by the simple interest rate R, which is 0.09. So I'll write in 0.09, and that will be multiplied by the amount of time t that we don't know. So I'll just write t there on the end. All right, and so now what we want to do is solve for t. So let's try to simplify anything we can in this equation and then work on isolating that variable or getting that variable by itself. All right, and so first of all, let's multiply 680 by 0.09. That would be 61.2 if you put it in a calculator. So we have 612 is equal to 61.2 multiplied by t. And then to solve for t, we just need to divide both sides of the equation by that coefficient of 61.2, right? Divide both sides by the number in front of t, and that will get rid of it, and you will have solved for t. T will be by itself. All right, so I will divide both sides by 61.2. And so these two will cancel out because anything divided by itself is 1, and 1 times t will just be t. And so then t is equal to 612 divided by 61.2. So let's rewrite that here. I'm going to flip the sides of the equation. T is equal to 612 divided by 61.2, and 612 divided by 61.2 is equal to 10. So 10 years, right? This is an amount of time t in years. That is the final answer to this problem. It will take 10 years for an investment of $680 to earn $612 in simple interest at an annual simple interest rate of 9%. For our next example, we have an investment of $3,000 earns $956.25 in interest over a period of 25 months. What is the annual simple interest rate? All right, so just like with our previous two examples, we're still going to use the same formula. We know that the interest earned, I, is equal to the amount of the investment, P, or the principal, multiplied by the annual simple interest rate, R, multiplied by the amount of time in years, T. And so let's try to identify as many of these values as we can in this problem. First of all, we have an investment of $3,000, so that will be our value of P. P is equal to 3,000. And we know that that investment earns $956.25 in interest. So that would be the amount of I. All right, I is equal to 956.25. And then what else do we know? Well, we are told that this takes place over a period of 25 months. All right, so that is the amount of time, but you have to be careful here. We are given the amount of time in months, but what we need for this equation is the amount of time in years. So we do have to convert this. And it's not too complicated. Just remember that there are 12 months in a year. So if you divide the number of months by 12, you will get the corresponding number of years. All right, so 25 divided by 12 is the amount of time in years. I'm not going to bother to write that out as a decimal. I'll just put this fraction right into this equation. Okay, and that's everything that we've been given. The only thing we do not know is the annual simple interest rate, R, and so we should be able to solve for it in this equation if we replace all the other letters with what we are given that they are equal to. So let's set it up. First of all, the interest is 956.25, so we'll have 956.25 is equal to the amount of the principal or the investment, which is 3,000. So we have 3,000 multiplied by R, the simple interest rate that we don't know. We're going to solve for it. And then that is multiplied by T, the amount of time in years, which we have found is 25 divided by 12, or 25 twelfths. Okay, and so now all that's left to do here is solve for this variable R. And so let's work on that. The first thing I'll do is simplify this side of the equation. We can multiply 3,000 by 25 divided by 12. If you do that, you'll get this 956.25 is equal to 6,250 times r. All right, so 3,000 times 25 divided by 12 will give you 6,250. And then in this equation, what we want to do is isolate r, or solve for it. So we have to get rid of this coefficient, or the number in front of it. So let's divide both sides of the equation by 6,250. And so that will look like this. We'll divide by 6,250 on both sides of the equation. And then these two will cancel out. Anything divided by itself is 1. 1 times r just leaves you with r. And r will be equal to 956.25 divided by 6,250. All right, so I'll rewrite that here. Our next step is that r, the annual simple interest rate, is equal to 956.25 divided by 6,250. And you definitely want to put that into a calculator. And if you do, you will find that the annual simple interest rate is 0.153, at least as a decimal, but typically the simple interest rates are given as a percentage. So while this is the correct answer, you could definitely box that in. It might be helpful to also write it as a percentage. So you can do that by either multiplying this value by 100 or by just moving the decimal place 2 places to the right. Either way, you will get the percentage of 15.3%. All right, that is the correct answer, or the solution to this investment problem. An investment of $3,000 that earns $956.25 in interest over a period of 25 months had a simple interest rate of 15.3%. Hey, real quick, before we take a look at the next example, if you find my videos here at JK Math to be helpful, then I'd like to invite you to join my membership site JK Math Plus, where you get access to many perks, including bonus content and my exclusive community. The bonus content includes dark mode versions of my videos, extra example problems, and more, while the community is a private space online where you can post questions, have discussions, and study together with me and other members. To learn how to join and see a full list of everything you'd get access to as a member, you can head over to jkmathematics.com/plus. I'll have a link for that in the description of this video. Okay, so if you're interested in becoming a member, feel free to check that out, as it's a great way to support me and the tutorials I make, as well as a great way for you to learn math better. But for now, let's take a look at the next example. For this investment problem, we have an investment counselor invested 75% of a client's money into a 9% annual simple interest fund. The remainder was invested in a 6% annual simple interest government bond. Find the amount invested in each account if the total annual interest earned is $3,300. Okay, so this is a more complicated investment problem. We are working with two different investments, right? The investment counselor puts 75% of their client's money into one account that has a 9% simple interest rate, and then put the rest of it, which would be 25%, right? If 75% is going in one account, then 25% is going in the other. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that amount is going into a second account with a 6% simple interest rate, okay? Or really, it's being invested in a government bond. And so given that information, we want to find the amount that is invested in each of those accounts if we know that the total interest earned between the two investments is $3,300. All right, so in this problem, do notice that we aren't given an amount of time. That is fairly common in these investment problems when you're working with multiple investments. So if you don't see an amount of time, you are allowed to assume that you're working with a time period of 1 year. And as you'll see, that will make our calculations a lot simpler. All right, but we're not just doing it to make things simple. We are allowed to make that assumption here because we're not told otherwise about the amount of time. All right, so for our equation, I is equal to P times R times T. If we're assuming that the amount of time is 1 year, then the value of time here would just be 1, and 1 times anything is just the value of whatever you're multiplying it by. So 1 times P times R would just be P times R. We can remove the amount of time from the equation, and this is what we're going to work with in this problem. All right, but now I'm going to start writing down some things that we know here, starting with the total annual interest earned. It's $3,300. I'm going to represent that like this. The total interest I is $3,300. And what that means is that that would be equal to the sum of the interest from the two different investments. All right, so there's going to be interest from the first investment where the money's being put into a fund. So we'll call that the interest from a fund. We would add that to the interest in the government bond. All right, so you would have the interest for the bond. That's what we can say about this $3,300. It is the total interest earned, so it would be the sum of the interest earned from each of the two investments, the interest from the fund and the interest from the bond. Okay, those are the only two investments that we are working with. We have a simple interest fund and we have a government bond. So now we know that this is true, but we probably want to figure out how to calculate these two different amounts of interest. So let's start with the interest in the fund. How would we calculate that? Well, we're going to use this equation. That amount of interest will be equal to the amount of the investment in that fund multiplied by the corresponding simple interest rate, which in this case is 9%, right? That is the simple interest rate for the simple interest fund. So for the fund, the interest earned, will be equal to the amount invested, which we are told is 75% of a client's money. All right, so let's just choose a variable to represent the amount of the client's money because we don't know what it is. That's what we're trying to find here. We want to know how much is invested in each account. So let's let the total amount of the client's money be represented by a variable X. So for the investment fund, 75% of X would be invested. And so you would multiply 75% by that value of X. All right, so the amount invested would be 0.75. That's 75% as a decimal, and you're multiplying that by X. All right, so that right there is our value of P for this equation for the investment fund. The amount invested is 0.75 times X, but then you want to multiply that by the simple interest rate of 9%, which as a decimal, 9% is 0.09. All right, so we're multiplying by 0.09. That is the simple interest rate for this scenario. All right, so this is how we would calculate the interest earned for the fund, but now what about the bond? Let's work on the bond here. The bond would also earn an amount of interest, and that would be equal to the amount invested in that account, which would be P multiplied by its simple interest rate, which would be 6%. But what would be the amount invested? Well, if the fund is getting 75% of the total money invested between the two accounts, then that means that the bond would get 25%. Okay, that would add up to 100%, 75% and 25%. All right, so you could just write down 0.25 times X. You're taking 25% of the total money invested. But if you didn't see that, another way that you could write that out is that if the fund has an investment of 0.75X, then what would be left over is the total amount of money X minus 0.75X. All right, so you could also write it like this. You would have the total amount of the money invested X minus the amount invested in the other fund, which is 0.75 times X. Okay, but that would just simplify to 0.25x because these are like terms, and 1x minus 0.75x would be 0.25x. Okay, so however you want to view it is fine, but I am just going to represent that with 0.25 times x. That is 25% of the total amount of money invested, and so that would be the amount invested in the bond, which would then be multiplied by the corresponding simple interest rate, which is 6%. And 6% as a decimal is 0.06. So we're going to be multiplying here by 0.06. Okay, so now we have ways to calculate the amount of interest in each of these accounts, but we don't know what x is, so we can't really calculate it. But what we can do is put these expressions into this equation right here. Right, we know that the total interest is $3,300, so that will be equal to the sum of these two calculations, the interest in the fund and the interest in the bond. So we can replace the interest in the fund in this equation with this expression and replace the interest for the bond with this expression. And that will give us the following equation. We'll have 3,300 is equal to the interest for the fund, which is this value right here, 0.75 times x times 0.09, and that will be added to the interest for the bond, which is this expression right here, 0.25 times x times 0.06. And now what we have here is an equation that we can solve using our equation solving skills in algebra, right? We have one unknown variable of x, and so we should try to simplify this equation and then isolate that variable x, or get it by itself to solve for its value. And once we have that, we'll know what the total amount of money was that was invested between the two accounts, and then we can just take that amount and multiply it by 0.75 to get the amount in the fund, and then multiply it by 0.25 to get the amount in the bond. And then we will know the amounts invested in each of the accounts. Okay, so let's work on solving this equation. First thing I'm going to do is simplify. Multiply 0.75 by 0.09 and 0.25 by 0.06. Doing that, we will get 3,300 is equal to 0.0675, and that's multiplied by x, and then that's added to 0.015 times x. All right, 0.75 times 0.09 is 0.0675, and 0.25 times 0.06 is 0.015. All right, and then we have two like terms here, right? Both of these terms have the same variable part of x, so we can combine their coefficients. We can add these two decimal values, and 0.0675 plus 0.015 will give you 0.0825. All right, so that will be multiplied by x, and that's equal to 3,300. And now, all we have to do to solve for x is divide both sides of the equation by this coefficient of x. So divide both sides by 0.0825, and then these two will cancel out, just leaving you with x is equal to 3,300 divided by 0.0825. All right, so here's what we have. X is equal to 3,300 divided by 0.0825, and putting that into a calculator, you get a value of 40,000. All right, $40,000 is the total amount invested between the two accounts, but that's not our final answer. We need to know how much was invested in each of them, how much went to the fund and how much went to the bond. All right, we want to know the amount invested in each account. So remember, for the fund, 75% of the client's money went into it. So we want to take 75% of x, or 0.75 multiplied by 40,000. So for the fund, 0.75 times 40,000 gives you that the amount invested was 30,000. That's 75% of 40,000. So that's one of our answers. And then for the bond, we will take 25% of x. That would be the amount invested in the bond. So we have 0.25 times 40,000, which will be equal to 10,000. All right, and that should make sense because those two amounts should total to 40,000, and they do. 30,000 plus 10,000 is 40,000. So clearly, 30,000 went into the fund, which is 75% of the total amount, and 10,000 went into the bond, which is 25% of the total amount. Okay, so those are the two answers. 30,000 was invested into a fund with a 9% simple interest rate, and 10,000 was invested into a bond with a 6% simple interest rate. Let's take a look at one more example for this video. For our last example, we have a university invested part of a $20,000 donation in stock that earns 8% annual simple interest, and the rest in a bond that earns 7% annual simple interest. The amount of interest earned each year is $1,520. How much was invested in each account? Okay, so this is very similar to our previous example. We're going to use the same exact problem-solving strategy to find the solution to this problem. We are given that the amount of interest earned each year is $1,520, so that is how much was earned total between the two investments in a one-year period. So the total interest earned would be 1,520. That is going to be equal to the sum of the amounts of interest from the two different investments that the university makes with that $20,000 donation. Okay, we don't know what the percentage amounts are, but they put part of it into a stock that earns 8% annual simple interest. So we will have interest earned from a stock, and then they put the rest of that money into a bond that earns 7% annual simple interest. So there is also interest for the bond. Okay, so the interest earned from the stock plus the interest earned from the bond will total out to $1,520 for a 1-year period. All right, so to calculate the interest for the stock and the bond, we will use the same formula that I is equal to the amount of the investment, P, times the simple interest rate, R, and technically you're still multiplying that by T, but we are working with a 1-year period here because the amount of interest earned each year is that amount. Okay, so we're just going to remove that T because it would be equal to 1 year, and 1 times anything doesn't change the value of what you're multiplying 1 by. Okay, so let's set up these calculations for the interest for both the stock and the bond. Let's start with the stock. The interest for the stock will be equal to the amount of the investment, P, and what would that be? Well, we know it's going to be part of a $20,000 donation, but we don't know the actual amount, okay? We're not even given a percentage of that amount like we were in the previous example. So what we'll say here is let's just let X be the amount invested in the stock, okay? So the investment P will just be X, and then we're multiplying that by the simple interest rate R, which for the stock is 8%. And 8% as a decimal is 0.08. So we're multiplying X by 0.08. All right, so that's for the stock, but what about the bond? Well, for the bond, the interest will be equal to a similar calculation, but the amount of the investment is different. If we let X be the amount invested in the stock, then that means that there should be a different amount invested in the bond. But don't pick another variable for that. You don't need to overcomplicate this. Think of it like this. If X is in the stock and there's a total of 20,000, then 20,000 minus X would have to be what's left over and what is put into the bond. All right, so the amount invested in the bond will be the total of 20,000 minus whatever was invested in the stock, which we let be equal to X. All right, so this is the amount invested in the bond, and that will be multiplied by the interest rate, specifically the simple interest rate for the bond, which is 7%. All right, that 7% as a decimal is 0.07. And so we'll multiply the amount of that investment by 0.07. Okay, so now we have set up the calculations for the interest earned by both the stock and the bond, but again, we can't actually calculate them because we don't know the actual amounts being invested into each of those accounts. Okay, but what we can do is make use of the total interest earned between the two accounts. We know that the sum of these two values should be 1,520, so we can set that equal to the sum of these two expressions. All right, so we have 1,520 is equal to the interest in the stock, which is X times 0.08. So I'll write that like this. We'll have 0.08 times X, and then we're adding that to the interest from the bond, which is this expression right here, 20,000 minus X multiplied by 0.07. Okay? And so just like with the previous example, we now have an equation with one unknown variable that we can solve for. We can use our equation solving skills that we've learned in previous videos of algebra to solve for that unknown value of X. And once we have it, we will then know the amount invested in the stock because we let X be that amount, and then we can just subtract that from 20,000 to figure out how much was invested in the bond, right? That's our end goal. We want to know how much was invested in each account, and so that's what we're going to find. All right, so we have to start by simplifying this equation. We need to get rid of these parentheses. So distribute 0.07 into this quantity, multiply it by both of those terms. So we'll have 1,520 is equal to 0.08 times X. And then you want to multiply 0.07 by 20,000. Doing that will give you positive 1,400. And then you want to multiply 0.07 by negative X. So multiply the coefficients. Negative 1 times 0.07 will give you negative 0.07 times that variable X. Okay, and so now we want to simplify further. Notice that we have two like terms here. They have the same variable part of X. So we can combine the coefficients, and 0.08 plus negative 0.07 would be 0.01. So what we have here is 1,520 is equal to 0.01 times X plus 1,400. And now our next step to isolating X, or solving for it, is to get rid of this constant term. So subtract 1400 from both sides of the equation. So let's do that here. I'll subtract 1400. On this side, that will leave us with 120, and that will be equal to 0.01 times x. All right, and then there's nothing there because 1400 minus itself is 0. All right, so now there's one thing left to do, and that is to divide both sides by the coefficient of x in order to isolate it and thereby solving for it. All right, so we want to divide both sides by 0.01. So let's do that here. I'll divide by 0.01 on both sides of the equation. These two will cancel out, and what you're left with is that x is equal to 120 divided by 0.01, which is equal to 12,000, specifically $12,000. All right, so what that means is that the value of x is $12,000, so that's the amount that was invested in the stock. So for the stock, the invested amount was $12,000. That's one of our answers. But then what about the bond? Well, the bond will get the rest of the money. If the total amount was $20,000 and $12,000 went into the stock, then $20,000 minus X, $12,000, will be the amount in the bond. And $20,000 minus $12,000 is $8,000. All right, I'll just write it down here. For the bond, we have $20,000 minus $12,000, which equals $8,000. That is the amount of money invested into the bond. Okay, and so that is it for this video. This was the last example, but if you do want to get some more practice with investment problems, I have another available on my membership site. So if that's something that interests you, feel free to look into becoming a member. You can find all the details on my website at jkmathematics.com/plus. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. But if you don't have any questions, this is all I had for now, so I will see you next time.